November 22, 1942. General Friedrich Paulus stares at four words that have just sentenced 300,000 men to death. The decoded radio transmission from Hitler's headquarters, 1,000 miles away, contains no ambiguity. Fortress Stalingrad will be held. Outside his command bunker at Gumrak Airfield, Soviet tank columns are closing a steel noose around the entire German Sixth Army. Paulus knows what every officer in this room knows. They have perhaps 48 hours to escape before the encirclement becomes absolute. The Führer has just ordered them to stay and die. This is the story of how one decision in 48 hours becomes the deadliest mistake in German military history. How hubris, impossible promises, and Adolf Hitler's refusal to accept reality trap an entire army in a frozen city on the Volga River. By the time the last shot fires 14 weeks from now, 91,000 frostbitten survivors shuffle into Soviet captivity. Fewer than 6,000 will ever see Germany again. It begins 3 days earlier, when Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov springs the trap that changes the entire war. November 19, 1942. 7:30 a.m. Soviet time. The ground explodes along a 200-mile arc north and south of Stalingrad. 3,500 Soviet guns open fire simultaneously. Operation Uranus, Marshal Zhukov's masterpiece of deception and concentration, has begun. But 24 hours later, the southern hammer falls with identical devastating effect. The Romanian Fourth Army, defending the steppe south of Stalingrad, collapses under coordinated assault from 5 Soviet armies. Soviet mechanized columns drive northwest on parallel courses, converging on a single objective. That objective is the town of Kalik on the Don, 40 miles west of Stalingrad. If those pincers outside, Soviet armies totaling more than 1 million men, the message contains those 4 words that will echo through military history. Fortress Stalingrad will be held. Not a strategic discussion. Not a request for options. An order from the Supreme Commander. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring has personally guaranteed Hitler that the Luftwaffe can supply the surrounded army entirely by air. 600 tons of supplies per day, Göring promises, enough food, ammunition, and fuel to sustain the pocket indefinitely while relief forces assemble outside and prepare their breakthrough. Hitler believes him without question. The Führer has been studying maps at the Berghof, remembering the Demayansk pocket the previous winter, where surrounded German forces held out for 11 weeks sustained entirely by airlift. Stalingrad will be Demayansk on a larger scale, a fortress that ties down massive Soviet forces while demonstrating German resilience. General Paulus reads the order with his Chief of Staff, Major General Arthur Schmidt. Schmidt, a fanatical Nazi loyalist who wears his party pin even in the bunker, immediately declares the decision strategically sound. Other staff officers are less certain. Colonel Wilhelm Adam, Paulus's operations officer, does the arithmetic at his desk. The Sixth Army requires minimum 550 tons of supplies daily, and that's starvation rations, minimal ammunition expenditure, essentially no fuel for vehicles. Göring promises 600 tons. The margin is razor-thin, but theoretically achievable if weather cooperates and Soviet fighter opposition remains manageable. What nobody in that bunker calculates, what nobody dares to calculate because it reveals the magnitude of the lie, is that the Luftwaffe at maximum effort will deliver an average of 94 tons per day. The airlift is doomed before the first transport even takes off. November 24th. The weather turns with brutal suddenness. Snow begins falling across the southern Russian steppe, thick heavy snow that grounds aircraft and reduces visibility to 50 meters. The temperature drops to -15 degrees Celsius. The Luftwaffe's first major supply mission launches from Tatsinskaya Airfield, 150 miles west of the pocket. 53 Junkers Ju-52 transport aircraft, the lumbering three-engine workhorses of German military aviation, struggle into gray skies. Each aircraft carries approximately 2 tons of supplies, mostly ammunition and fuel, very little food. Soviet fighters, Yak-1s and Lag-3s painted winter camouflage white, tear into the unescorted transports. The Ju-52s are slow, obsolete, defenseless. 22 aircraft are shot down in flames. 16 return with battle damage. Total delivered to Stalingrad that day is 47 tons, less than 1/10 of minimum requirements. Inside the Kessel, German soldiers received their first reduced rations. The official daily allocation drops from 2,000 calories to 1,700. Soldiers joke grimly about the Stalingrad diet, about losing weight for their return to Germany. Nobody's laughing by week's end when the ration drops again. Paulus establishes his defensive perimeter across the pocket's 800 square miles of frozen steppe and urban ruins. He distributes his forces in a rough oval, with the strongest positions facing west, the direction any relief attempt must come from. His panzer divisions, now critically short of fuel, dig their remaining tanks into static positions as armored pillboxes. The mighty Wehrmacht, which has conquered from the Atlantic coast to the Volga River in 3 years of unbroken victories, is now immobile, defenseless, utterly dependent on Hermann Göring's failing promises. 300 miles west, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, Germany's most brilliant operational commander, assembles the relief force. Operation Winterstorm will require 3 weeks to gather sufficient armor and infantry. He needs to pull divisions from other sectors, reorganize shattered units, accumulate fuel and ammunition. The Sixth Army must hold their pocket for at least 4 weeks. On current rations and supply deliveries, they have food for 12 days. December 1st, 1942. The first horses are slaughtered for food. German veterinary units begin systematically butchering the 10,000 horses trapped inside the pocket. The meat is distributed to frontline divisions, approximately 100 grams per man per day. It's enough to prevent immediate starvation, not enough to maintain combat effectiveness in temperatures now reaching -20 degrees. Medical officers report increasing cases of frostbite, dysentery, and typhus. The field hospitals, underground facilities in Stalingrad's ruins, are overwhelmed within days. Every available surgeon works 18-hour shifts amputating gangrenous limbs. The airfield at Potomnik, the pocket's primary supply lifeline, handles grim reverse traffic. Every outbound flight carries wounded being evacuated. Priority goes to specialists the Army cannot replace: pilots, experienced engineers, veteran NCOs with critical technical skills. The Luftwaffe's airlift struggles desperately against impossible conditions. General Martin Fiebig, commanding Luftwaffe's transport units, sends increasingly pessimistic reports to Göring's headquarters. Soviet fighters swarm every supply flight. The Soviets have established what German pilots call the Flak Corridor, a 30-mile gauntlet of anti-aircraft batteries that every transport must traverse approaching Stalingrad. The obsolete Ju-52 aircraft are massacred in the skies. The Luftwaffe begins converting faster He-111 medium bombers into transports, sacrificing cargo capacity for speed and defensive armament. It helps marginally. Daily deliveries average 120 tons, less than 1/4 of minimum requirements. Units inside the pocket begin consolidating as casualties mount from combat, frostbite, and disease. Full-strength divisions are amalgamated into battle groups. The 389th Infantry Division, which entered the pocket with 11,000 men in November, reports 4,000 combat-effective soldiers by mid-December. Similar statistics ripple across every formation. Commanders face impossible mathematics, defending 800 square miles with forces designed to hold perhaps 300, while simultaneously starving, freezing, and running out of ammunition. December 12, 1942. The relief attempt begins. Manstein's Operation Winter Storm launches with 4th Panzer Army spearheading the thrust toward the Kessel from the southwest. 230 tanks, including the powerful new Tiger I heavy tanks making their Eastern Front debut, advance through snow and Soviet resistance. Inside the pocket, Paulus receives electrifying news over the radio. Rescue is coming. The relief force is driving toward them. Soldiers hear the distant rumble of artillery moving closer each day, the sound of hope, the sound of German panzers crushing Soviet opposition. Manstein's armor advances 40 miles in 4 days, a remarkable achievement through winter conditions and against determined resistance. On December 16, his spearhead reaches the Mishkova River, just 35 miles from Stalingrad's southwestern perimeter. This is the moment, the critical decision point that historians will debate for decades. Manstein radios Paulus with Operation Thunderclap, the breakout plan. The 6th Army must attack southwest simultaneously with 4th Panzer Army's final thrust. Together, attacking from opposite directions, they can rupture the Soviet encirclement. The gap will be narrow, perhaps only a few miles wide. But it will be enough. Tanks and vehicles go first, infantry follows on foot, wounded are left behind temporarily to be recovered after the link-up. Manstein needs Paulus to commit his remaining armor and mechanized forces immediately, within 24 hours, while the corridor of advance remains open. Paulus hesitates. He radios Hitler's headquarters requesting permission to abandon Stalingrad and execute the breakout. The response arrives within 2 hours. Negative. Hold the pocket at current positions. Await relief. The Führer insists that abandoning Stalingrad means abandoning the entire strategic position on the Volga. Germany cannot retreat. The city bearing Stalin's name cannot be surrendered. The hesitation costs everything. While Paulus awaits authorization that never comes, Soviet reserves slam into Manstein's overstretched spearhead. The Stavka, Soviet High Command, has been holding back armies specifically for this contingency. On December 16, Soviet forces launch Operation Little Saturn, a massive counteroffensive targeting Italian positions on the northern shoulder, far behind Manstein's advance. The Italians, equipped even worse than the Romanians, collapse almost immediately. Within 48 hours, Soviet tank columns are driving deep toward Tatsinskaya, the primary Luftwaffe supply base for the Stalingrad airlift. If Tatsinskaya falls, the airlift dies completely. Manstein, suddenly fighting for his own survival rather than rescuing Paulus, begins withdrawing 4th Panzer Army to prevent encirclement of his relief force. By December 23, Operation Winter Storm has failed completely. 4th Panzer Army retreats back to its starting positions. The closest German forces ever come to Stalingrad is 35 miles. Christmas 1942. Inside the Kessel transforms into a nightmare beyond description. Soldiers huddle in frozen dugouts and ruined basements, burning furniture for warmth, burning books, burning anything combustible. The temperature drops to minus 30 degrees Celsius and stays there for days. Frostbite casualties exceed combat casualties by a factor of 3 to 1. German medical records, meticulously maintained even in disaster, document 24,000 severe frostbite cases in December alone. Amputations. Gangrenous limbs. Men who simply stop moving and freeze solid in their positions, discovered days later still gripping their weapons. The daily ration is now reduced to 300 grams of bread, 200 grams of horse meat, and 20 grams of fat. Approximately 700 calories per day for men expected to fight in subarctic conditions, to stand watch in exposed positions, to dig frozen earth with inadequate tools. Soldiers begin exhibiting classic starvation symptoms visible to anyone with medical training. Lethargy and weakness. Hallucinations and psychological collapse. The inability to concentrate or follow complex orders. Unit cohesion starts fracturing at the most basic level. Incidents of unauthorized slaughter of remaining horses multiply despite threat of court-martial. Theft of supplies from field kitchens becomes epidemic. Reports surface, quickly suppressed, of men attacking supply convoys or even murdering comrades for their rations. Military police battalions, themselves starving and frostbitten, attempt to maintain order through summary executions. The Luftwaffe's airlift has become a death lottery for aircrews and a starvation lottery for soldiers on the ground. On December 27, Soviet fighters shoot down 11 transports in a single afternoon. Ju-52 wreckage litters the steppe around Potomnik airfield like aluminum tombstones marking where each crew died. German pilots call the Stalingrad run the one-way ticket. Experienced crews are physically exhausted, flying 3 missions per day in aircraft never designed for such intensive operations in winter conditions. Mechanical failures multiply as maintenance becomes impossible. Aircraft return with engines failing, controls frozen, hydraulic systems ruptured. The average daily delivery drops to 75 tons. Then 60. Then 50. January 1943 brings the final phase of systematic destruction. Soviet forces, having defeated Manstein's relief attempt, now turn their full attention to crushing the Kessel with overwhelming force. Operation Ring, the Soviet plan for liquidating the pocket, begins January 10. For Soviet armies, totaling 47 divisions with massive artillery support, attack from all directions simultaneously. The German perimeter, held by men too weak to resist effectively, collapses in sections. Entire battalions, incapable of sustained combat, surrender or are overrun within hours. Soviet commanders are astonished at how little resistance they encounter. German soldiers emerge from ruins waving white flags made from bandages or torn undershirts. They can barely walk. Many cannot stand without support. They're walking corpses in Wehrmacht uniforms. January 16 brings the fall of Potomnik airfield. Soviet tanks overrun the facility. The Luftwaffe shifts operations to Gumrak, a smaller emergency field closer to the city center. Supply deliveries drop catastrophically. 50 tons per day. Then 40. Then 30. Parachute drops become impossible as Soviet anti-aircraft fire blankets remaining German positions. On January 22, Gumrak falls. The last airfield is gone. A handful of transports attempt desperate parachute drops into an improvised landing zone inside Stalingrad itself, dropping supplies from 500 meters into Soviet anti-aircraft fire. Most canisters drift into Soviet positions. The airlift, Göring's promised lifeline, Hitler's justification for the standfast order that doomed 300,000 men, officially ends. The Sixth Army now occupies a pocket 15 miles by 9 miles, shrinking daily under relentless Soviet pressure. Soldiers receive no food for days at a time. Water comes from melted snow contaminated with corpses and human waste. Medical supplies are non-existent. Wounded men lie in unheated cellars with no anesthesia, no antibiotics, no bandages, no hope of recovery. The death rate from starvation and exposure exceeds combat casualties. 500 men die daily from cold and hunger alone, their bodies stacked like cordwood in frozen piles because the ground is too hard to dig graves. January 24, 1943. General Paulus divides the Sixth Army into two isolated pockets after Soviet attacks split German forces. The northern pocket holds approximately 40,000 men under General Karl Strecker's 11 Corps. The southern pocket, larger and centered on the Univermag department store in downtown Stalingrad, contains Army headquarters and approximately 100,000 soldiers. The pockets cannot communicate with each other. Radio contact is sporadic. Each fights alone now, isolated, without coordination. The collapse accelerates beyond any military precedent. German soldiers, their combat effectiveness destroyed by starvation, disease, and frostbite, surrender in groups. Squads. Platoons. Entire companies emerging from ruins, hands raised, begging for food before captivity. Soviet forces are genuinely shocked by what they capture. Private Anatoly Mereshko, a Soviet staff officer who enters Stalingrad as the pocket collapses, writes in his diary. These are not the same Germans who reached the Volga in September. These are walking corpses, scarecrows in Wehrmacht uniforms. Many cannot stand without support. Their eyes are dead. They do not react to questions or commands. They simply stand, swaying, waiting for food or death, whichever comes first. Typhus sweeps through the remaining positions like fire through dry grass. With no sanitation, no medical care, no clean water, epidemic diseases run completely unchecked. Dysentery, typhus, tuberculosis. German doctors estimate 70% of surviving soldiers suffer from at least one serious disease. Field hospitals are charnel houses where wounded men lie three to a stretcher, begging for morphine that doesn't exist, for bandages that ran out weeks ago, for doctors who cannot save them. Paulus, isolated in his underground headquarters beneath the Univermag department store, receives Hitler's final messages via radio. Promotion to Field Marshal arrives January 30th, an empty honor designed to send an unmistakable message. No German field marshal has ever surrendered in history. Hitler's meaning is transparent. Die fighting or commit suicide. The Führer demands heroic resistance to the last bullet, last man, last breath. He wants Stalingrad to become a legend of German sacrifice, a Thermopylae for the 20th century. Paulus, gaunt and exhausted, holding himself together through sheer discipline, stares at the promotion certificate transmitted by radio. He's just become the youngest field marshal in Wehrmacht history at age 52. His army no longer exists as a fighting force. January 31st, 1943. 7:45 a.m. Soviet soldiers stormed the Univermag department store. They descend into the basement command bunker, weapons ready, expecting final fanatical resistance from Hitler's newly promoted field marshal. Instead, they find Friedrich Paulus sitting at a wooden table in a small concrete room. He's wearing a clean uniform, somehow impossibly maintaining military appearance while his army died around him. He doesn't resist. He doesn't speak initially. Soviet General Mikhail Shumilov formally accepts his surrender. The last radio transmission from 6th Army headquarters reaches Hitler's Wolf's Lair at 7:40 a.m. The Russians are at the door. We are destroying equipment. Then silence. Radio operators in East Prussia listen to static. Hitler rages in his underground bunker. He's given Paulus every opportunity for glorious death. The promotion. The direct orders. The historical examples of commanders who chose death over dishonor. Paulus has chosen life. The Führer will never forgive him. The northern pocket under General Strecker fights on for 2 more days, not from hope because there is no hope, but because Strecker believes surrender is dishonorable for German officers. His soldiers, delirious with hunger and disease, fight until their ammunition is completely exhausted. They have no food, no water, no medical supplies, no reason to continue except orders. On February 2, 1943, at 9 a.m., the northern pocket surrenders. The Battle of Stalingrad is over. The final count staggers comprehension. Soviet forces capture 91,000 prisoners. These are the survivors, though that word barely applies to starving, diseased men who can barely walk. 24 German generals surrender, including Paulus. Soviet intelligence estimates approximately 140,000 German soldiers died during the encirclement from combat, starvation, disease, and exposure. Total German casualties for the entire Stalingrad campaign from August 1942 through February 1943 exceeds 750,000 dead, wounded, or captured. It is the single greatest military disaster in German history. The Sixth Army, once the Wehrmacht's elite spearhead, has been erased from existence. The prisoner columns shuffle west through frozen ruins. 91,000 German and Romanian soldiers begin the death march to Soviet POW camps in the Ural Mountains in Siberia. Their walking skeletons wrapped in rags, barely recognizable as human beings. Soviet guards, hardened by years of brutal warfare, are visibly disturbed by what they're escorting. These prisoners lack the strength to walk more than a few miles per day. They collapse by hundreds, dying in the snow where they fall, their bodies left behind because nobody has energy to bury them. The Soviet POW camp system is catastrophically unprepared for such massive numbers of critically ill prisoners. Camps designed for thousands receive tens of thousands. There's insufficient food, no medical facilities, no proper shelter. The prisoners arrive diseased, starving, frostbitten, psychologically shattered beyond repair. They die by thousands in the first weeks of captivity. Soviet records document 27,000 German POWs dead before March 1943. From typhus, dysentery, starvation, and exposure. They survived Stalingrad's hell only to die in captivity. Of the 91,000 who surrendered, approximately 6,000 eventually returned to Germany, most not until 1955. A full decade after the war's end. The immediate strategic consequences ripple across the entire Eastern Front within days of Stalingrad's fall. Germany has lost not just an army, but an irreplaceable force of experienced combat veterans. The Sixth Army contained the Wehrmacht's most seasoned infantry divisions, units battle-hardened since the invasion of France in 1940. Commanded by officers who'd fought from the Channel coast to the gates of Moscow. Those men, that institutional knowledge, that combat effectiveness built over 3 years of continuous warfare, gone forever. The German army will never recover this loss. Individual soldiers can be trained in months. Unit cohesion and veteran leadership take years to develop. 22 divisions worth of experience has been deleted from German order of battle. Soviet propagandists exploit the victory with ruthless efficiency. Radio Moscow broadcasts lists of captured generals, reading names and ranks for hours. Leaflets dropped over German positions across the Eastern Front show photographs of Field Marshal Paulus in Soviet captivity, looking gaunt but alive. The message to German soldiers is unmistakable. If a field marshal can surrender, if an entire army can be destroyed, the Wehrmacht is not invincible. German morale, both military and civilian, sustains a psychological blow that military historians argue proves more damaging than the material losses. Soldiers begin questioning whether victory is possible. Civilians begin understanding the war might be lost. Hitler orders 3 days of national mourning beginning February 4th. German newspapers print black-bordered announcements with Gothic script headlines. They died so that Germany might live. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels, in his famous Sportpalast speech on February 18, 1943, channels the disaster into calls for total war, mobilization of every resource, every citizen, every ounce of German industrial and human strength for the struggle. The subtext is unmistakable to anyone listening carefully. Germany is now fighting for survival, not conquest. Stalingrad marks the psychological turning point where German leadership and population both begin realizing the war might be lost. The myth of invincibility dies in Stalingrad's ruins. Field Marshal von Manstein conducts brilliant defensive operations through spring 1943, stabilizing the southern front with his famous backhand blow counteroffensive that recaptures Kharkov. But he's fighting with depleted forces, improvising with units pulled from quiet sectors, desperately juggling limited reserves. The formations that might have reinforced his counteroffensives, that might have made his tactical brilliance strategically decisive, are frozen corpses in Stalingrad. Every German operation from February 1943 onward bears the shadow of Stalingrad's missing divisions. Military historians have spent 80 years analyzing Hitler's November 22 decision. The consensus among serious scholars is uniformly damning. British historian Anthony Beevor, author of the definitive work Stalingrad, The Fateful Siege, argues Hitler's standfast order was militarily indefensible by any rational analysis. American historian David Glantz, perhaps the preeminent Western expert on Eastern Front operations, calculates that an immediate breakout on November 23 or 24 had approximately 70% probability of success. The Soviet encirclement was still porous. German forces retained mobility and fuel. Winter weather hadn't yet completely immobilized operations. The window existed for 48 hours, perhaps 72 at most. German generals who survived the war are unanimous in their post-war assessments. General Hans Dörr, writing in the 1950s, states with unusual bluntness for a German officer discussing Hitler, the decision to hold Stalingrad was the Führer's greatest single mistake of the entire war. Every competent military professional understood the Sixth Army must withdraw immediately or face annihilation. General Siegfried Westphal, operations officer for Field Marshal Kesselring, argues in his memoirs that Hitler's consistent interference in operational decisions, systematically overruling professional military judgment with ideological imperatives, cost Germany the war as much as Allied material superiority did. The alternative history scenarios, while necessarily speculative, are compelling exercises in strategic analysis. If the Sixth Army had executed an immediate breakout in late November 1942, German forces could have established defensible winter positions along the Don River line, approximately 75 miles west of Stalingrad. The 22 divisions lost at Stalingrad, withdrawn intact and reinforced through winter 1943. might have made Manstein's subsequent counteroffensive successful enough to permanently stabilize the southern front. The war in the east might have stalemated along defensive lines Germany could sustain indefinitely, potentially leading to negotiated peace rather than unconditional surrender and total destruction. But Hitler chose ideology over strategy, symbolism over survival. Stalingrad must be held because Stalingrad bore Stalin's name. That reasoning, that substitution of political symbolism for military necessity, condemned 300,000 men to death. The Luftwaffe's failure compounds the tragedy into farce. Hermann Göring's promise of 600 tons daily supply was based on the Demayansk precedent from winter 1941. -42. But Demayansk had held fewer than 100,000 men in a much smaller pocket with significantly shorter supply flights and lighter Soviet opposition. Luftwaffe Transport Commander General Hans-Georg von Richthofen, in his personal diary later recovered by historians, calls Göring's promise criminal fantasy born of ignorance and arrogance. The numbers were mathematically impossible from the start. Soviet fighter presence and strength, winter weather conditions, and the sheer scale of requirements made aerial supply completely unfeasible. Historian Jeffrey Megargee at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum argues that Hitler accepted Göring's promise because he desperately wanted to believe it, a textbook case of confirmation bias operating at the highest level of command with catastrophic consequences. A rational analysis would have revealed the airlift's impossibility within hours of examining available resources and requirements. Hitler chose belief over reality. That choice sealed the Sixth Army's fate before the first transport aircraft even took off. Return now to that underground command bunker, November 22, 1942. General Friedrich Paulus holds the decoded radio message from Adolf Hitler's headquarters. 4 words on paper. Fortress Stalingrad will be held. Outside, beyond the concrete walls and frozen earth above him, 300,000 German soldiers are beginning the countdown to death, though they don't yet understand what's been decided for them. The choice has been made. In 48 hours, the window for escape will close forever. The steel noose will tighten until it becomes inescapable. The airlift that might theoretically sustain them exists only in Hermann Göring's imagination and Hitler's delusional strategic calculations. This is how empires die. Not in single apocalyptic battles, but in accumulated decisions where ideology overrules military reality, where political symbolism trumps operational necessity, where leaders refuse to acknowledge catastrophic mistakes until those mistakes become irreversible. Hitler could have ordered withdrawal on November 22 when encirclement was fresh and escape still feasible. He could have authorized breakout on November 24 when Paulus radioed his desperate assessment. He could have accepted any of Paulus's repeated requests through December while Manstein assembled the relief force. At each decision point, at each critical moment, military rationality offered escape routes. At each decision point, Hitler chose destruction over retreat, symbol over survival, ideology over the lives of 300,000 men. The numbers tell part of Stalingrad's story, but cannot capture its human dimension. 22 divisions erased from German order of battle. 91,000 prisoners captured. Fewer than 6,000 survivors returning to Germany over the next decade. 140,000 dead from combat, starvation, disease, and cold during the encirclement alone. But statistics cannot capture individual tragedies. The soldier who froze to death in a sniper position waiting for supplies that never came. The wounded man who died screaming without morphine in an underground hospital that ran out of medicine in December. The prisoners who survived battle only to die of typhus in Soviet camps. The families across Germany who received telegrams stating their sons and husbands and fathers were missing at Stalingrad, knowing that missing at Stalingrad meant frozen in ruins forever, unmarked, unrecovered, gone. Stalingrad became mythology almost immediately for both sides. Soviet mythology celebrated heroic resistance against fascist invasion, the defenders who held the city through months of desperate fighting, the victory that turned the tide of the Great Patriotic War. German mythology spoke of betrayal and sacrifice, of soldiers abandoned by incompetent leadership, of the Sixth Army's martyrdom for the fatherland. The truth is simpler and more terrible than either nation's mythology admits. Stalingrad was an avoidable disaster, engineered by Hitler's refusal to retreat, enabled by Göring's lies, and suffered by 300,000 men who had no choice but to obey orders they recognized as death sentences. Today, the ruins of Stalingrad, now renamed Volgograd, contain monuments and museums. The Mamayev Kurgan Memorial Complex towers over the city, its massive motherland calls statue visible for miles, commemorating the Soviet defenders who held the city. German dead remain largely unmarked, still lying in the frozen ground where they fell 80 years ago. The 48-hour decision that killed them exists now as historical artifact, Hitler's radio transmission from November 22, 1942. Preserved in archives as documentary evidence of catastrophic leadership. Military academies worldwide study Stalingrad as the definitive example of strategic overreach, logistical failure, and command hubris disconnected from battlefield reality. The lessons transcend historical period or national military doctrine. When ideology replaces reality in strategic planning, when leaders refuse to acknowledge failure until failure becomes catastrophic, when pride prevents necessary retreat, armies die. Soldiers pay with their lives for their commanders' mistakes. That is Stalingrad's legacy. That is the cost of 48 hours when Adolf Hitler chose symbolism over survival. That is why 300,000 German soldiers froze and starved in a ruined city on the Volga River while the man who sent them there refused to let them escape. Remember them not as statistics, but as human beings who deserved better leadership, better decisions, and a chance to survive.